Hello, and welcome to the B2C Commerce Cloud introduction session. I'm Thomas, and I will be your host today. And I will be guiding you through the world of B2C Commerce Cloud and how it fits within the Salesforce ecosystem. But before we get started, let me talk a little bit about myself. My name is Thomas Teunen, and I am a certified B2C Commerce Cloud architect, and until recently also a instructor for the Trailhead Academy B2C Commerce Cloud Architect course. Unfortunately, this was discontinued, but I'm hoping that somewhere in the future a new one will rise from its ashes. But until then, no architect course available on Trailhead Academy. I am also a Golden Hoodie and MVP now for a couple of years, and also the author of the Rhino Inquisitor. If after this session you decide you want to learn more or dig into a bit more detail on B2C Commerce Cloud, I invite you to go to my blog. I've written over 100 articles in the meanwhile in the past, 3 to 4 years. 3 years. Where I write about comparisons, specific features, how to configure specific topics, about development, about things you shouldn't do on B2C Commerce Cloud, but giving you examples how to do them anyways, and a lot more. Before I was a B2C Commerce Cloud developer, I was a Java developer for 7 years for a different e-commerce platform called Intershop, where I did, some similar development than I am doing now for B2C Commerce Cloud, but I'll get into some of those details later on once we get to the different tech stacks that people are using in the front end. And besides all of the stuff that I am doing for Salesforce, I am also a volunteer at a local theater group where I do everything except stand on that stage. I'll leave that honor to my wife. I just make sure that everything around the theater is working. I do the lights, lighting, sound, bringing drinks to people, standing at the bar, building the stage, just making sure I do not have to stand on that stage. So what's our agenda for today? So we're going to look at what is B2C Commerce Cloud and what's this demandware that I see in the hallways. What are the different tech stacks in B2C Commerce Cloud? And headless, how does that fit into our story? And finally, getting a sandbox and a demo of setting up one of those tech stacks and getting into the nitty-gritty of the details. So let's get started. But before we get into the development part, we have to look at a little bit of history. So what's demandware and how does Salesforce B2C Commerce Cloud come into the picture? And for that, we have to look at this timeline. So in 2004, Demandware was founded, but it was acquired 12 years later by Salesforce and rebranded to B2C Commerce Cloud. I think this was around the time that a lot of acquisitions started to happen, and that spree has not stopped until now. And in 2014, there was an acquisition by Demandware, which was called Sequotient. If you look into Demandware, B2C Commerce Cloud now, you will see that it has been rebranded also to Einstein. But this Einstein is completely different from what you have on the core. It's still a separate product. You still see references in the URL to Sequotient, but there is no relation to all of the other Einstein products that you see on the market today. And then after 2016, of course, Salesforce took over and a lot of things still happened. Some questions that people have posed over the years, so I'm going to list a few. So can a Salesforce developer immediately start on B2C Commerce Cloud? What coding languages do I need to know? And what should I learn before I can get started? So by the end of this course, by the end of the session, I'm hoping that you'll have answers to these questions, or at least you'll have a starting point on where to look for more information to guide you on your path. But first things first, a bit of clarification on Commerce Cloud within the Salesforce ecosystem is that there's multiple products that live under the same wing. We have B2C Commerce Cloud, there was B2B2C. At one point, this was renamed to D2C, so direct to consumer, for the people wondering what D2C stands for. and B2B. Now, B2C is a completely separate stack with different logins, different URLs than B2B. B2B and D2C are on the core platform. I think a familiar term maybe for people who look into Commerce Cloud before is Commerce on Core. This refers to the D2C and B2B offering that Salesforce has provided us. One of the big differences is, well, if you're used to the Salesforce platform, you will know the concept of managed packages and unmanaged packages. This concept does not exist in B2C Commerce Cloud. The only thing we know is something called cartridges. And I think the closest comparison that we have is that a cartridge is always a unmanaged package. You always get the full source in a zip file, basically, and that is uploaded to the server to be then used in the front end or in the back end. And this has to be done by a developer or by your CI/CD system, but there is no wizard installers or something like that available to B2C Commerce Cloud. If you buy something, for example, on the App Exchange, then you will probably get a zip file and you'll have to ask a developer to upload it to the instance. Another big difference is profiles and permissions. While on the core platform, the amount of options you have for permissions and access to records and objects, etc., even a separate certificate for that, it's not that complicated on B2C Commerce Cloud. You do have roles and permissions, but generally it's more access to modules, saying someone has read access to products, you have access to all of the products. You have write access to products, you have write access to all of the records within products. There's nothing keeping you from modifying specific products. And this is true for all of the modules. There are still, just like Salesforce, a lot of configuration options available in something we call the Business Manager, which is the setup menu that you know from the core platform. And, well, as a developer, there are also some major differences. What's the development language in B2C Commerce Cloud? Well, that's JavaScript for both the back and the front end. Combine that with some CSS like Bootstrap. And if we're going into React, which I will explain at a later stage when we're looking at the different options for the front end, we have Checker UI. While on B2B and D2C, you have familiar Apex, Flow, Lightning Web Runtime, and also a big difference is the availability of API options. On B2C Commerce Cloud, you basically have REST. You have something called the Open Commerce API and the Salesforce Commerce API, which I will come back to later. While on B2B and D2C, you have a lot more options when it comes to integrations with third parties. Now, the good thing about B2C Commerce Cloud is because you have so little options for integrations, well, so little, I mean you have enough options for integrations, is that it's a lot easier to architect solutions because it's more straightforward which the best option is to do an integration. While for B2B or D2C, you're going to have to do a more extensive investigation as to licensing, to what type of API is being called, how many API calls are happening, etc., to decide which option is best for you. And another big difference is, well, not big difference, depends on what you do in the Salesforce ecosystem, is that you will be working mostly in the front end. If we talk about Salesforce terms, you will be working in Experience Cloud a lot. Why? We're building a site which is customer facing, which means that most of the development has to go to front end. And what are the different options that we have within B2C Commerce Cloud to build that front end? And here we see a timeline of all of the different architectures, similar like you had Aura going to the Lightning Web Runtime within Salesforce. There has been an evolution, which makes sense. I mean, technology evolves over time. That every 5 years, about 4 to 5 years, a big technology change happens on B2C Commerce Cloud. And this story starts in 2009 with Site Genesis running on something called pipelines. 5 years later, we have Site Genesis version 2.0, with pipelines and controllers. But let's talk about what's a pipeline. Well, this is a pipeline. If you look at the screenshot, you might think, this looks awfully familiar. This looks like flow. Well, actually, you're right. This is a low-code kind of implementation that Demandware uses, where you would drag in blocks in pipelines to build up the data that you needed to render a page. So as an example, we have a more complex, I think this is one of the easiest pipelines that you could have, is a content page. Let's, for example, an FAQ page or a blog page that needs to be rendered for a specific URL. Let's say brand.com/FAQ/shipments. And if someone entered that URL in their browser, the show starting point would be called, which is at the left of this example. The first thing we see is a get content block. And what's that going to do? It's going to take a request parameter as the input, which is the ID of your content, and it's going to return the record, or it's not going to return the record. So there's two exit nodes on get content, one being the error not found, meaning that someone entered the URL for a piece of content that no longer exists, or they filled with the URL, causing an exception. If it is found, it continues on. We see a sub pipeline being called, a concept that also exists in Flow. Search get cont, which probably means search get content, to search for related content to this page. So if you're looking at an FAQ, there might be some other questions that relate to this one that we want to render on the page that the customer is looking at. After we get the content, there is the update page metadata. Since we're looking at a customer-facing site, which means that also bots come by, we need to make sure that the page title, description, and every other meta tags that we use on a public page has been filled in correctly. Once we have the metadata, there is a if statement, so an expression below, which can be yes or no. Empty content template, so this is an attribute on our content. Is there a custom template configured? Yes. Okay, then we're going to render that template, which results in a dynamic endpoint. Or if it's empty, then we're going to use our default content page template to render the HTML or ISML to our customer. Now, the HTML templates are ISML. So this is similar to HTML. Basically, you're going to write your HTML pages, but there's a layer on top that gives you some extra modules that you can use for security or to expand the page or reuse code in the front-end language. So this is proprietary. So you need to get used to the syntax, things like isIf or isModule are example modules that you would be using within that template. Like isIf is for a if statement, isElse is then for the second option, etc. But we're not going to go into too much detail on this. One important note is that pipelines, even though if you look at the timeline, 2009-2014 is about 10 years ago, this is still a way of working that is actively used. For good or for worse, a lot of projects still make use of pipelines or are in a hybrid mode where they have pipelines and controllers within the same project. Many of those projects are looking to migrate either to SFRA or the PWA kit, but it is a complete tech stack change, so that takes a lot of effort and also, a lot of calculations when it comes to budget to see if the transformation makes sense. So if you come into the B2C Commerce Cloud ecosystem, be sure that you will run into pipelines probably for the next coming years still on existing projects. New projects, however, will make use of the more modern tech stacks that have been made available, and we'll move on to the timeline. So after Site Genesis, we see controllers, and after that, 2017, mobile first reference architecture, and 2018, a rebrand, basically renaming of the MFRA to the storefront reference architecture. They all make use of controllers. which is, well, JavaScript, question mark. Why is it JavaScript, question mark? Well, actually, Demandware runs on Java behind the scenes, but as developers, we interact with that system using JavaScript. And that is made possible because of an engine called the Rhino engine, which translates JavaScript to Java at runtime. And yeah, it probably comes to no surprise that that has some caveats when it comes to development. You cannot use everything you know from JavaScript, and especially if you're used to Node, where you can install thousands of packages into your projects to make your life easier. Well, not exactly the same on the backend of B2C Commerce Cloud, because a lot of these packages make use of different languages like C or Python, which is something that B2C Commerce Cloud does not understand. So you can't just upload some random Node modules to B2C Commerce Cloud backend and expect it to work. It's probably going to throw some random exceptions, function not found, or unable to parse file, etc. I spent a couple of years sometime on a public library, which transformed some of the most used ones to backend JavaScript, but it took a lot of effort. So this is not something that you do on a whim on a project with a deadline. So that's one of the biggest things that you need to think about. It also has some specific global variables that you can use. You see a few ones of these in the example, request, response, etc. are continuously available to you to expand or get information from. In the front end, you will be using the same, well, JavaScript, but there you have the full power of Node, etc., because it will be compiled by Webpack, which means that you can use any Node package that you want in the front end code. But the back end is where this is not possible. And then we come to, well, 2021, where another acquisition happened of Mobify, which was a React-based headless front end. And this is where headless comes into the picture that we talked about earlier. And yeah, that's where we got Mobify, which was rebranded to the PWA kit, and the managed runtime, which was then renamed to the Composable Storefront, which is the joining of the runtime and the front-end package. The runtime is where everything is hosted, so everything is taken away from you. You do not have to worry about hosting the package. And the PWA kit is your React project that you will be deploying to the PWA kit. And that development happens in React. So the backend still remains what you saw in SFRA and SiteGenesis with the controller JavaScript. So APIs are still written in that fashion, but your front end has now been transformed to React. And that has quite a few advantages, not just for projects, but also for yourself, is that we've moved away from proprietary languages. So React was chosen as the go-to language because, well, it's something called boring technology. Why is it boring? Well, it's been proven. It's older. It's been around for, I think, now more than a decade. And it has quite a bit of a following, which means that you have a lot of public videos available. People are active on different locations like Stack Overflow, YouTube, Slack, etc., all with knowledge on React. While when we look back to pipelines or SiteGenesis, a lot of the exceptions you had, you could not find anything on Google. Why? It's closed source, it's proprietary, only a few people probably posted something on Stack Overflow. I think I found a few questions of 3 years old with no answers. While for React, you look for an exception, you probably find 5 blog articles, of YouTube video explaining exactly what the problem is and where you can fix it. And this is good for projects. This is good for your career because, well, you're not limited to proprietary knowledge. So if something happens in the long run, and you your career moves you away from Salesforce, you have knowledge that also fits for mobile application development, web application development that has nothing to do with Salesforce. Not that I'm hoping that this is necessary, but it does give you more perspective in the long run, as this knowledge is, well, more global. But I talked about headless now. So what is headless? To put it bluntly, it's separating your front end from your back end. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. So in this case, where the backend in Commerce Cloud is where all of the data lives, where the API lives, and our front end is the PWA kit, which is deployed separately. So what does headless give as advantages? Well, it gives you freedom of and more flexibility when it comes to putting things live. If you look at the other option, a monolith, you would have to deploy your backend and your front-end code separately. And probably most of you have already done headless, maybe even without knowing it. If you have a mobile application connected to a Salesforce instance through API, you're already headless. Did you build a tablet endless aisle application or a tool that connects to the REST API or some other API that Salesforce offers to build a desktop application? That's headless. You build your front end separately from your backend, which means 2 separate code repositories that you can deploy separately as well. You can go even further by splitting up your front end project into multiple projects. Let's say your checkout is a separate project, your product detail page is a separate project, but let's not go into those details just yet. I think that's for another episode or some research that you can do after viewing this session. And what does that look like in B2C Commerce Cloud? Well, when Composable came into the picture and headless, it basically meant splitting up your projects into multiple layers. Now, this was one of the diagrams I built for a Salesforce blog post, I think a year ago. Now, this has to be updated, so you're going to see at the bottom, there is the REST API being used. This used to be MuleSoft, but has in the meanwhile been migrated to Cloudflare Edge functions, if I'm not mistaken. And that also shows one of the advantages of separating your components. It means that you can deploy them independently without affecting the other parts of your architecture. So MuleSoft was removed and replaced by Cloudflare. And honestly, I didn't even notice that this happened. And that's the advantage of that separation, is that things like complete architecture changes can happen without actually having to know in all of the other systems. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's first explain this diagram. So at the top left, we have our front end. So the Composable Storefront that we talked about earlier, which contains the managed runtime, which is our hosting and environment management tool, which hosts our PWA kit projects. So a managed runtime can have X projects built on a PWA kit, so can host multiple React applications. And those React applications, they talk to the Salesforce Commerce API, which is also referred to as the SCAPI, which is the most modern API offering that Salesforce has and also pushes people to use as the only option to build your front-end projects on. So like I said, it makes it pretty easy if you only have one option. But there is still a second one, because if we continue on in this diagram, we move over to the right and we see Cloudflare again when we move up on the right. And Cloudflare moves into the Open Commerce API. And what is that Open Commerce API? Well, the Open Commerce API was the first API, REST API, that Demandware made available. I mean, it's been along even from before that I started working with Demandware. So it's the first headless API that they offered to build mobile applications, endless aisle applications with. But a few years back, especially after the acquisition of MuleSoft, something new came up, which was called the SCAPI. This is a separate layer that, depending on which API you call will directly call the database, call a separate microservice, or call a open commerce API behind the scenes and act more like a proxy service. Now, there are still some differences between both. There are a few APIs that the Open Commerce API has that the SCAPI does not have yet, but the gaps have been closing pretty rapidly in the past year, leaving probably in a year or two that there's no real reason to use the Open Commerce API anymore. Let's go back to our diagram. That Open Commerce API exposes front-end and also back-end data to a third party, an integration with an order management system or possibly a mobile application. And in this case, our PWA kit, which is our headless front-end. And that fetches our data from the backend, Salesforce B2C Commerce Cloud, and that's where our data lives, our products, our inventory, our pricing, customers, etc., so that they can be made available to our headless storefront. Now, the B2C Commerce Cloud one has been simplified because behind the scenes there are a few services still operating. You have your search index, which is a separate service. We have our order index. Our basket service is technically something separated. There are some other login frameworks being used, but we're not going to go into those details. Again, I've written a blog post explaining all of the different components that are running behind the scenes. And yes, well, one thing, if this was a diagram where we use SFRA or Site Genesis, there would only be one block, and that would be the top right one, Salesforce B2C Commerce Cloud, and we would add just the front end as a block in that part. We would not, well, the Open Commerce API is available, but we do not have to actively use it. There is no Composable Storefront, and the SCAPI is also an optional use. But for SFRA, it's hosted on the same application servers that the data is stored on. So this is a prime show of what the separation means. And also in this situation, we have multiple deployments that we have to do. So our front end has a completely separate way of deploying than our back end. And if something that has to be done on both simultaneously, you have to set up a good CI/CD system to make sure that your deployments and your cache clearing, etc., happens at the correct timings. So a lot more orchestration is necessary, and that's where complexity becomes a challenge. Headless is okay, but a composable architecture where you even add more third-party systems into the mix, that's where things become complicated. But I think that's a topic where a lot more hours can be talked about. And this is not where we're going to be going today. So you probably want to see it in action, right? So let's have a demo on how we can set up that composable storefront. Now, it's important to note, I can only teach you how to set up a composable storefront locally because that is open source. But for Site Genesis and SFRA, you actually need your own sandbox to be able to set this up, which is not true for the composable storefront. Now, we'll get into the details on sandboxes after this demo, but let's first look at the PWA kit. So if we look at the PWA kit, you go to the URL pwakit.mobifystorefront.com. So I talked about Mobify before. That's the original name of the product, but was rebranded to the PWA kit and manage runtime. If you go to this page, you're going to see a nice link to getting started, and also already the command that we're going to be needing later on. So let's first click that get started. And that's going to give you a help page to get you started as a developer and how to set up the PWA kit. It's going to explain some concepts. What's a PWA? What's the managed runtime? What's Mobify doing in the mix, etc. So, but what is also interesting to look at is the skills for success. So what do you need to know to start developing in the B2A kit? Well, Salesforce built a nice article with some links to courses and documentation to get you started on making sure you have all of the tools to start building for the B2A kit. So be sure to look at the pages behind that link. But let's set up a B2A kit locally. So we can go to the open source GitHub. It's going to show us which command we have to execute. So I'm going to copy this command and move over to my Visual Studio Code. Now I cheated. I already have a demo ready because we probably don't want to be waiting for an npm install. But let's create a second directory and execute this command. So it's going to do, it's going to ask us a question, choose a project preset to get started. The retail app using your own Commerce Cloud instance. Well, we don't have one. So we're going to go for the second option, the retail app with a demo Commerce Cloud instance. And I press enter. And that's all of the questions that we're going to be getting. It's going to start installing and it might take a few minutes. So I'm hoping it's going to be quicker, but in the meanwhile, let's start a second window in our console and go to our retail app and follow the guide here, run the project locally, npm start. And if all goes well, it's going to open up a browser window. I'm going to wait for it to build. Let me make this window a little bit smaller. There we go. So we have our project running. That was quick. That was easy. Not a lot of complex questions to do. Let's move over our Visual Studio Code a little bit. And how quickly can you get, well, developing? So we're going to open our project over here. And it's going to look pretty much like any React project with a few exceptions. The directory structure is going to look a little bit specific, also because a lot of third-party packages have already been decided for us. While on most React projects, you're going to start deciding yourself what are you going to be using. But since this is a starter template, a lot of those decisions have been made for us, which also, of course, makes it a lot easier to start. So I want to override this home page. So I'm just going to show how we can do this as a quick example. So we have our page, our home, our index. There we go. So this is our React visualization of our homepage. And I want to change this hello extensible React template. So I'm going to dig into the code and I'm going to find my hero banner. This is a hero banner. And I have my title right over here, custom home title. Let me change this to hello everyone and save my file. I'm going to see that stuff is already happening in our console. There we go. It's already changed. So I do not have to do any refreshes. We have automatic rebuilds of what is happening. And we can follow along on what the page is doing in our console. So it's that easy to get started developing for the B2A kit. Now, of course, this is a React project. There's a lot of components involved and a lot of specificities. And we're not going to be digging into those today. But at least you have a starting point now where you can boot up your own project. It will be connected to a backend that is up and running 24/7, allowing you to develop your own custom module or do a proof of concept of integrating maybe a third-party CMS or adding an identity provider or creating a blogging page as an example. There's a lot of things that you can try to get working in this React project. Besides that, we also have Trailhead, of course, to our availability. So there are a few trails available, but one thing to keep in mind with Trailhead is that if you're used to trails on the core platform, as a developer, you can easily boot up a sandbox. It's linked to your trail. It will verify what you're doing is correct, etc. This is not the case for B2C Commerce Cloud. Most of the trails are for administrators, webmasters to get to learn the business manager, and also for architects to get to know the configurations. But most of these trails are videos or images and text, but there are no really exercises that will be automatically verified by the Trailhead system. So keep that in mind when you go through Trailhead, is that you do not have to start looking for a button to create a sandbox. That does not exist on B2C Commerce Cloud because it is not built on the Salesforce platform. Maybe at one point in the future this will become possible, but currently I do not see anything on the roadmap to make this available. So here are a few trails that you can do as a developer, an architect, and a bit of everything. And now, of course, you will have the question, how do I get a sandbox anyways, if it's not through Trailhead? Well, I'm not gonna be the bearer of good news. Until a year ago, the only options that you had to get a sandbox is to follow a Trailhead Academy course, be a Salesforce partner or ISV, or a Salesforce customer for B2C Commerce Cloud specifically. So both partner and customer, you have to be a specific partner or customer for B2C Commerce Cloud, which means that it can be quite the challenge to get a sandbox. Now, this year, a new option has been put out working together with Salesforce, which is the Open SFCC sandbox, where we have been given the option to provide sandboxes to certain people who want to work on open source projects. So this is still not for people wanting to fiddle around with B2C Commerce Cloud. No, this is specifically aimed for people who probably already work with B2C Commerce Cloud, have an idea, want to build an integration, make it open source, and then make it available to the public. Also to assist already existing open source projects where you maybe found a dead project on GitHub that made an extension on B2C Commerce Cloud, and you want to continue the work or assist that developer in building up that specific integration. I just want to share this URL. If you want to work on an open source project for B2C Commerce Cloud, this could help you get a sandbox, but otherwise you will have to be working for a existing partner or be a customer for B2C Commerce Cloud. Now, this is only the case if you really want to work in the backend or for SFRA or site genesis. Like I showed already for the PWA kit, you can just boot up your front end and start building. And that will give you experience to maybe apply for a job with an existing partner or customer, because you will have PWA kit experience and you know what you're getting yourself into. So that will at least give you a bit of a boost to get your way onto a sandbox and deeper into the B2C Commerce Cloud ecosystem. Thank you for listening. I hope a lot of your questions about B2C Commerce Cloud have now been answered. And hopefully we'll see you next time and see you in the ecosystem on B2C Commerce Cloud. Thank you, and until next time.